What if everything Wall Street assumed about AI spending was backwards? Goldman Sachs has a new angle that flips the AI infrastructure story on its head. While everyone was panicking about cheaper AI model training, Goldman's Sung Cho revealed that the market missed the real story entirely. The actual game changer isn't about training costs at all, but about the massive compute requirements for reasoning models like DeepSeek's R1. This fundamental misunderstanding led to wildly incorrect predictions about AI infrastructure spending, and now Goldman is projecting hyperscaler capex will hit $427 billion by 2027. The street got it wrong, and the implications are huge. Here's what really happened. The Great Wall Street Panic that missed the point. When DeepSeek's R1 model went viral in January, Wall Street had a complete meltdown. Nvidia plunged 17% in one day, dragging semiconductors to multi-month lows as the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index fell to its lowest level in months. Panic spread across trading floors as investors became convinced that cheaper training costs would destroy the entire AI infrastructure boom. The logic seemed bulletproof to Wall Street analysts. If AI models could be trained for such low costs, why would hyperscalers need to spend hundreds of billions on compute infrastructure? Morgan Stanley downgraded semiconductor stocks across the board, while analysts slashed their capex projections for major tech companies. The fear was simple and seemingly logical. If training costs dropped by 90%, infrastructure spending would follow. This panic selling wiped out billions in market value within 48 hours. The key misconception driving this chaos was that training costs were the primary driver of AI infrastructure demand. Wall Street had convinced itself that the massive capex spending from Meta, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon was all about training bigger and better models. If training became cheaper, the thinking went, all that spending would disappear. But while traders saw collapsing training bills, Goldman's Sung Cho was tracking a different metric. While other analysts were focused on training costs, Cho understood that the real compute demands were coming from something entirely different. The market was fixated on the wrong metric, while missing the actual revolution happening in AI infrastructure. The real story wasn't about training costs at all. It was about inference compute requirements for reasoning models like DeepSeek's R1. These models don't just generate text like traditional language models. They perform complex reasoning tasks that require orders of magnitude more computational power during inference than regular AI models. When a reasoning model processes a query, it has to work through multiple steps of logical thinking. Each step requires significant compute resources. A single inference request can trigger computation chains that are 10 to 100 times more intensive than traditional language model responses. This creates massive demand for inference infrastructure that dwarfs anything required for model training. Wall Street completely missed this distinction. They saw DeepSeek's low training costs and assumed this meant reduced infrastructure needs. But training a reasoning model is just the beginning. The real compute demands come when these models are deployed and start processing user requests at scale. The market focused on a one-time training cost, while ignoring the ongoing massive compute requirements for running reasoning models in production. This fundamental misunderstanding led to the panic selling that wiped billions from AI company valuations. Goldman's Sung Cho recognized that Wall Street was measuring the wrong thing entirely, while missing the actual compute revolution that reasoning models represent. What Cho saw coming would reshape everything Wall Street thought they knew about AI infrastructure spending. The three forces Goldman says will drive AI spending to $427 billion. Sung Cho developed a three-factor framework explaining why AI infrastructure spending is accelerating instead of slowing down. The first factor centers on Meta's aggressive hiring campaign. Meta is hiring roughly 50 top AI researchers, already securing over a dozen, signaling that the race to build advanced models is heating up. The company is paying massive signing bonuses and directly poaching researchers from OpenAI, Anthropic, and other frontier AI companies. Goldman's projection numbers are staggering. Hyperscaler capex will hit $427 billion by 2027, up from $330 billion in 2024 and $391 billion in 2026. This represents the fastest infrastructure spending acceleration in modern history, with 2024 alone showing almost 50% growth from the previous year. The third factor involves policy changes, opening foreign chip demand, particularly relaxation of certain export restrictions. These policy shifts create new markets for AI infrastructure that weren't accessible before. Countries and companies that previously couldn't access advanced AI chips now represent significant demand sources. This expanded market increases total addressable demand for AI infrastructure providers. The second factor involves reasoning models, creating unprecedented demand for inference compute. Unlike traditional language models that generate responses in a single forward pass, reasoning models work through problems step by step. A single user query to a reasoning model can trigger computation chains that consume 10 to 100 times more resources than traditional language model responses. This computational intensity creates entirely new infrastructure requirements that cloud providers must address with specialized hardware configurations. When companies compete this aggressively for AI talent, it signals that the model development cycle is intensifying rather than winding down. Each new researcher Meta hires requires substantial compute infrastructure to support their work. Training runs for experimental models multiply infrastructure demands exponentially. Meta's willingness to engage in bidding wars for AI talent proves that major tech companies see the current moment as critical for establishing competitive advantages. Companies don't spend tens of millions on signing bonuses unless they believe the potential returns justify the investment. Goldman's projections show these three factors converging to create what they call the biggest capital cycle since railroads. The railroad comparison is particularly apt because both represent fundamental infrastructure buildouts that enable entirely new categories of economic activity. Just as railroads required massive upfront capital investment to create transportation networks, AI infrastructure requires enormous spending to create the computational networks that will power the next generation of applications. The numbers tell the story clearly. Meta alone went from spending $31 billion in capex to projections of nearly twice that amount. This represents a fundamental shift from the year of efficiency to what analysts are calling the year of AI. But while Goldman's framework explains why spending should accelerate, real-world evidence from the companies driving this narrative tells a more complex story. Why DeepSeek's R2 struggles prove Goldman right. DeepSeek's R2, slated for May, still hasn't shipped because benchmarks fell short. The company's CEO remains unsatisfied with the model's performance despite months of engineering refinement. The goal was to improve coding ability and introduce reasoning in languages other than English, but internal standards apparently aren't being met. The real problem goes beyond just model performance issues. Export restrictions and local capacity shortfalls have left China's cloud unable to serve R2. Chinese cloud providers can't handle the inference demands that R2 would create if DeepSeek actually released it. A surge in demand would quickly overwhelm the inference capacity of Chinese cloud infrastructure. This infrastructure crisis proves Goldman's point about reasoning models requiring massive compute resources for inference operations. The chip shortage problem makes DeepSeek's situation even worse. R2 runs best on Nvidia H20 chips, which were banned from export in April. This creates a hardware bottleneck that DeepSeek can't solve by throwing more money at the problem. The company is stuck trying to optimize their model for inferior hardware that can't deliver the performance R2 was designed to achieve. DeepSeek engineers have been providing cloud companies with technical specifications to guide deployment on alternative chips, but this is clearly a compromise solution. The irony here is striking. DeepSeek supposedly showed that AI training could be done cheaply, sparking panic about the end of AI infrastructure spending, but now they can't even deploy their follow-up model due to infrastructure limitations. This contradiction exposes the fundamental flaw in Wall Street's original analysis. Training costs are irrelevant if you can't actually run the models you've trained. Export controls are successfully limiting Chinese AI progress by restricting access to advanced inference hardware. The ban on H20 chips directly impacts DeepSeek's ability to deploy R2, demonstrating how geopolitical factors influence AI development. Chinese companies can develop sophisticated models, but they can't deploy them effectively without access to specialized hardware designed for inference workloads. R2 was intended to showcase Huawei's competing Ascent chips, but supply or performance issues have reportedly affected its rollout. This suggests that domestic Chinese alternatives can't match the performance of restricted Nvidia hardware. DeepSeek's engineers are working to adapt their model for available infrastructure, but this represents a significant compromise that affects model performance and deployment capabilities. DeepSeek's inability to deploy R2 underscores that inference compute, not training cost, drives the next wave of AI spending. The company that sparked Wall Street's panic about cheap AI training can't deploy their own models due to inference compute limitations. This real-world evidence validates Goldman's framework, while revealing how completely the market misunderstood what was actually happening in AI infrastructure. The market made two critical errors that cost investors billions. First, they mistook training costs for the real driver, when reasoning models actually demand massive inference compute. Second, they missed Goldman's projection of $427 billion in hyperscaler capex by 2027. These are not whispers of declining spend, but clear signals from Meta's hiring blitz to policy shifts that the AI infrastructure boom is accelerating into a new era. The reasoning model revolution requires specialized infrastructure at unprecedented scale, creating entirely new categories of compute demand. Now the question is, which companies will harness this inference compute wave? What do you think will power the next AI infrastructure boom? Let me know in the comments.